Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Europa Rediviva. A few days ago, Matthias Desmet, a clinical psychologist from Ghent University, appeared in Pascal Lotta's podcast, Neutrality Studies, to speak about the mental build-up that accompanies this military build-up in Europe on the same along the same lines as it happened during the pandemic when he became famous. He started speaking in 2021 against this mass formation phenomenon that was going on in the minds of the European public, that these measures that were quite totalitarian in nature were necessary, indispensable, and there was no way to think outside of it, and there was no limit in terms of human rights that could be drawn, and the people who opposed them were just bad people and so on. So this kind of mental construction that people had during the pandemic, the people who were in favor of the corona measures and who were discriminating against the unvaccinated and so on. So he spoke about how this entire mass formation phenomenon that was going on during the pandemic is now transplanted into the military sphere, and the European public is being slowly accustomed to the idea that there will be this war with Russia, and they are being trained to not question the premises of the war narrative, because if they have to be used as cannon fodder, if they have to be used in these military operations against Russia, they have to be willing soldiers, and they have to be unquestioning members of the, let's say, home army who produces the weapons back home. And a soldier should not doubt the necessity of the war. A soldier has to be in this mindset that war is necessary, that it is virtuous, that we are on the right side of history, and that it will be an easy win, but you have to make some sacrifices. So they have to believe all sorts of things, which sometimes might even be contradictory. But it is necessary in order to have a society that is prepared for war. It is necessary to condition the members of the public, to condition public opinion to think along these lines, including to accept contradictions, just like, for example, Russia is weak and it is laughable and we make fun of Russia. It is gas station masquerading as a country, and the Russian soldiers are fighting with shovels and they are eating each other because of starvation on the front lines, and they are eating dogs and whatever. But at the same time, Russia is this menace that will invade the whole of Europe and will reach Portugal if we don't stop it in Ukraine and so on. So the members of the public are trained to think in such a way as to accept the official contradictions in order to make them willing soldiers and unquestioned to make them citizens that do not question the narrative, that do not vote for parties that want to oppose this trajectory, and so on. And a part of this mass formation that I think was not touched upon enough is the normalcy bias. It's this psychological phenomenon that I saw also during the pandemic in Romania. And I'm seeing it also in Romania with respect to this military build-up. I saw this piece of news this morning. In my opinion, a normal, a sane human being should worry at the piece of news saying that NATO is building an oleoduct, so a pipeline delivering oil and gas from Turkey to the Eastern Front, meaning Romania. Which is only for military purposes. So it is not for civilian use. It was in the piece of news itself, quoting Bloomberg. So there are these war preparations that are being made, these logistic war preparations, that have explicit military use, there is no deniability. Like, for example, in the past 6 months, there was the announcement that works started on the highway from Romania to Odessa, and the piece of news was accompanied with ideas like, yeah, it's in order to bolster tourism. There will be a lot of tourists going to the Odessa region after the war is over, and so on. So of course I did not believe this lame excuse, but at least they tried, you know. But like when you have this piece of news saying Turkey is building this NATO pipeline for exclusive military use, meaning the whatever gasoline, whatever will be pumped through it will only be for the military. It will not be for civilians. And you read this piece of news that its destination is the Eastern Front, meaning Romania, and you wonder, okay, this is item number 973 saying we are being goaded into war. We are being primed for war in the coming years. But this is what I wanted to talk about in this episode. Just like when the virus was spreading in Italy, and I realized it was going to come to Romania as well, it was going to spread on the entire planet, and I started raising the alarm, and I made this Facebook group. It was the first Facebook group in Romania, the first kind of organization in Romania to discuss the coronavirus and the fact that there will be a lockdown and that there's no treatment and all these things, and to get medics involved and to get health specialists involved into how to design some sort of measures for the upcoming pandemic. There were many members of the public, like I would say the majority, and also among the specialists, who had all the data to realize that this virus will create a pandemic because of its parameters of transmission and of mortality. Yet they were not only completely unwilling to examine this from this angle and to take it seriously. They were just laughing at it, and they were saying that whoever believes that there will be a pandemic is a nutcase, and that everybody who believes in the coronavirus is a crank, just like conspiracy theorists and so on. So the members of the health establishment in Romania, at least this was my experience there because I was living there at the time, were dismissing laughingly the possibility of a pandemic just because they had not been informed on the official channels. So the official channels were still denying that this virus will create a pandemic and that there will be lockdowns and so on. And they were just parroting the official line. They were not able to think for themselves, even though their training was sufficient for them to draw the right conclusions. That this virus was highly infectious, that it was spreading faster than measles, and therefore everybody was going to get it, and its mortality is slightly higher than that of the flu. And therefore it will lead to a pandemic on the same lines as there were the flu pandemics. So if a strain of flu that was particularly infectious or particularly deadly created a pandemic, then of course the coronavirus that was more infectious than the flu and more deadly than the flu would obviously create the pandemic. It was not rocket science. It was quite obvious for anybody who wanted to think, but the majority of the members of even of the medical establishment didn't want to think, and they just made fun of everybody who believed that there would be a pandemic, and but that did not stop them to also parrot the official line in all sorts of absurd decisions that were being made during the pandemic. So even though they had to wait for the official announcement to realize that there is a pandemic, once the genetic vaccine was rolled out, they were also upholding the official narrative, even though the official narrative was absolutely stupid. So the official narrative was saying things like the vaccine works, but we have to get everybody vaccinated because otherwise the unvaccinated are infecting the vaccinated. So it either works or it doesn't, you know. It's not like it works, but you just have to not meet the virus, because then if you meet the virus, it stops working. This is not what a vaccine working should mean. And they were also supporting all sorts of other retarded narratives, like it's not experimental because we say so. I mean, messenger RNA was never put into humans before 2020, before the experimental work started regarding the corona vaccine of Pfizer and Moderna. Even though it was studied since the 1990s, up until 2020, it had only been put into rats. It had never, ever been put into humans. And 6 months later, we had this mRNA-based corona vaccine, and members of the medical establishment would laugh at people who said that it's experimental, even though it had never been put into humans before the human trials of the corona vaccine. This is how experimental the technique itself was, not only the vaccines. Because, okay, you might say that even Sinovac, which was made of attenuated virus or inactivated coronavirus, you could say even that is experimental in the sense that it's a newly debuted product. But in the genetic vaccines that were used in the West, even the technology itself was experimental, not only the product. But anyway, so even though their medical judgment should have led them to the correct conclusions regarding the risk-benefit ratio of this vaccine towards people who had already become immune through infection, or to babies that had no specific risk for the coronavirus infection and so on. Their better judgment should have led them to be skeptical of the official positions, yet they were just zombies of the narrative and they were following it to its last conclusion. If the World Health Organization or the Health Ministry had said to wear butt plugs in order to prevent transmission, they would have worn butt plugs and they would have said that this is what science wants from us and we should obey science, even though they were perfectly trained doctors, medical professionals, and so on. So even though they had a scientific education, they could have worn a cucumber in their ass if the health authorities had told them so, and they would have defended it, laughing at anybody who said that that's outrageous or that's not scientific. So we have something similar going on in Europe regarding the war buildup. Just like during the pandemic, you had this mass of people blindly following the narrative, being completely immune to its contradictions. Also now you have this mass European population following the narrative that we have to defeat Hitler again and we have to fight the Nazis, which are the Russians, and so on. And just like during the pandemic, you had this also part of society who had this normalcy bias and who didn't see the discrimination, they didn't see the human rights abuses. For example, in Austria was perhaps the most totalitarian European country during the corona pandemic. Totalitarian in terms of measures against the unvaccinated. So society was split between the 70% who took the vaccine and the 30% who wouldn't take the vaccine. And the state became completely totalitarian against them. So for 6 months there was the lockdown of the unvaccinated, and the first piece of legislation was passed in Austria to perpetually punish the unvaccinated through quarterly fines of thousands of euros. And of course, the end goal could have only been to put them in camps, because once you are barred from working and you have these fines that you are not able to pay, coming every quarter. Like it was 3,500 euros every quarter. So that's like 14,000 euros a year in fines for not being vaccinated. There was no way in which you could afford a house. Even if you owned it already, then you had to give it up to pay the fines. And if you were renting, you could not afford rent. So something had to be done in the end to house all of these unvaccinated people. And probably the solution would have been camps for the unvaccinated. And there was a majority of the Austrian public supporting these measures, but also not seeing the consequences, not seeing the fact that it's completely draconian and that it is completely totalitarian. They were having this normalcy bias that all the measures taken against the unvaccinated are democratic and are liberal, and the unvaccinated are the fascists and they are the oppressors and so on. And the same is happening with the war measures. This majority of the European society which supports the upcoming war is trained to think that the people who oppose the war narrative are traitors, Putin puppets, fascists, and so on. But at the same time, they're also trained to ignore the war buildup. And I have direct experience with this living in Romania. I used to live in Romania until this year. And the people who I was speaking with regarding the war preparations were somehow incredulous, in the sense that even though they could see the pieces of news with their own eyes, we periodically get all of these news items with the date of the upcoming war. Is it going to be 2030? Is it going to be 2029 when Russia will attack a NATO country, and so on and so forth? Even though they were aware of these pieces of news, even though they were aware of the military buildup, the fact that the reserve of the Romanian army is being called for exercises on a rotating basis, and that we have all these war games in Romania and all this war infrastructure being built in the east, and our cooperation inside the Odessa Triangle, this newly made format of Romania, Moldova, and the Odessa region, creating some sort of common military district, and the Bucharest Nine, the Eastern Flank, the Coalition of the Willing, all of these things, even though they were out in the open, it was no secret, it was no conspiracy that somebody like me might invoke. It was all out in the public domain. Most members of the public would not accept that there is a war coming. So just like during the early part of the pandemic, when people had no desire for such an event to come, and therefore they wished it away, therefore they pretended not to see, or they actively refused to see the signs that this was coming. The same thing is going on in Romania, just because, of course, nobody wants to grapple with the thought, to ponder the thought that in 2 or 3 years they will be a society at war. They will be just like Ukraine. Nobody wants to make preparations for this. It's like because it's a life-changing event. You have to start thinking where to leave the country, to liquidate your assets, and so on. So just because people don't want to do this exercise, they don't want to engage with this problem, they mentally look for evidence or discard. They look for evidence to the contrary, and they discard the huge pile of evidence that the war is coming. So I saw people invoking whatever memes on TikTok or something that said that war was going to start in September last year, and the fact that it did not start in September last year, they saw it as evidence that it's never going to start, or that the people who say that the war is coming are liars, and so on. Even though this information that war is coming comes also through the official channels. I mean, you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to observe the fact that society is becoming militarized. free elections are no longer possible because whichever candidate wants to oppose the war is either not allowed to run, or in case he or she runs and wins, then the elections are cancelled. It's obvious for anybody who wants to see this that Romania is being prepared for war. But if you don't want to see it, then you're free not to see it, and you can always cling on to pieces of evidence to the contrary, or you can simply ignore everything and just actively dismiss any kind of piece of information in this direction, even though it may come from official channels, as I would say the majority of the news come. So this is what I wanted to talk to you about today, this phenomenon of normalcy bias, which is part of the mass formation. It is important on the one hand to instill this kind of psychosis, war psychosis in people, to get them motivated into going to war, just like during the pandemic you had them motivated into persecuting the unvaccinated and to have as many doses of vaccine as were required of them, just out of duty and out of some sort of wrongly understood ethics. But you also have the flip side of the coin, which is the normalcy bias. You have to instill into the members of society also the fact that nothing really important is going on, that nothing really life-changing is about to happen, so that they do not panic. I guess it's a mechanism that is instilled through this social engineering process in order to basically keep the frog in the boiling pot and to not allow it to jump. So people probably need to be engineered in this way. The psyche of the people needs to be engineered so as for them to be willing participants in this, which probably they would not. They would prefer not to be. But on the one hand, they need to have the war psychosis in order to participate in it, and at the same time, they need to have this normalcy bias to think that actually everything is normal and nothing extraordinary is happening, so as not to make any contingency plans, not to plan their escape, or to somehow break out of this mindset. Because okay, one thing you can do is you can prepare some sort of exit scenario, maybe, I don't know, move to Spain, for example, which is probably going to be a neutral country in the Third World War, just like it was in the first two World Wars, or get out of Europe completely. But something that people might also do is they could break out of the spell, they could break out of the mass hypnosis phenomenon, and they could start questioning the assumptions. Why do we need to go to war? And then if they start reading about all the fake pretenses under which we are herded into this war, they might realize that they've been lied to and might protest. Or I don't know. But it's hard. This is why manipulation works. This is why propaganda works. Members of the Western public are also trained to think that propaganda is what the enemy does. So they have to steer away from any pieces of information coming from outside NATO, because that's liable to be propaganda. That's very likely to be propaganda and disinformation. Whereas the news that they consume and the opinions that they consume from Western sources, even though they come from this strictly military NATO command, they're not propaganda. They're not manipulative. They're just trustworthy and objective. And this is how they allow themselves to be brainwashed into doing whatever stupid things, like support the measures against the unvaccinated, and now going to war against Russia, committing collective suicide. They know that propaganda exists, and they are somehow under the impression that it is not being used against them, because they they do not read Russian or Chinese media. So therefore, they are immune to propaganda because they do not expose themselves to the opposite point of view. It's somehow very stupid if you think about it, but they interiorized this point of view that critical thinking means to believe what the government says and to doubt everything that somebody who questions the official narrative might say. In Romania, in the past years, the philosophy faculty of the University of Bucharest was employed in this this information operation in other faculties and in other universities, disguised as critical thinking courses. So members of the faculty of philosophy, professors, would go and teach critical thinking because during the pandemic there were a lot of people who did not adhere to the official point of view, and something had to be done. And so the measure that was devised was to have philosophers go and teach students how to be skeptical of information that contradicts the official point of view of the government. This is what critical thinking came to mean. So yeah, we are under this social engineering process, and this creates this mass phenomenon, this mass formation phenomenon, which has as flip side this normalcy bias that prevents the frog from jumping out of the pot with water that is slowly turned to a boil. This is what I wanted to tell you today. If you like what I do, like, share, subscribe, and if you want to support my work, you'll find a link in the description of the channel how to do so. So until next time, take care.